dwells on them, and in part to its great compass and strength, alpine scenery and battled ocean, blah, blah, blah. The same will be true of our system of railroads. Its vastness and magnificence will prove communicable and add to the standard of intellect of our country. So you get a train, and we all get a higher IQ. It's a nice idea. So again, and this is Scientific American, this is not just some dweeb talking, it's great fun reading back issues of Scientific American. Again, the same thing, as the train is now getting closer to crossing the continent, the iron horse, the earth shaker, the fire breather, which tramples down the hills, which outruns the laggard wind, which leaps over rivers, oh wonderful stuff, grinds rocks to powder, break down the gates of mountains, he too shall build an empire and an epic, shall not solitude and waste places cry for gladness at his coming. So now we're getting sort of poetic evocation of what these things are going to do, and yet again, by the time we start to talk about it connecting the two coasts, the almost complete annihilation of time and space, and this sounds just like, that was 50 years earlier, that application for a patent for the balloon, complete annihilation of space and time between the distant antipodal points of the American continent produced by the construction of the Pacific Railroad. And that actually gets to, and we'll see several examples of it in earlier ones, this little notion that we get a new technology and it's going to annihilate time and space. And that becomes an absolute key phrase when people say this is now the technology that's going to put us uniquely and directly into touch with people wherever they are. And it fills, right up till nowadays, the notion of the annihilation of time and space. It's odd, because it's actually a quotation that goes back to three English poets of the early 18th century, Arbuthnot, Pope, and Swift. Nobody quite knows which of them, but they were writing a spoof poem. They were writing a parody of lovers' poems, and they said this is the ideal thing that a lover wants, is actually always be exactly in the place, so what we need is some way to annihilate time and space that separates the two of us. So they were kind of having fun at saying, everybody writes this in their poems. The phrase has been taken up and ramified again and again, so that we get, after the canal boat, after the train, the next technology comes along, and we get a line of telegraph from London to Karachi, and from thence to every part of India. Intelligence and commands be daily and hourly communicated with the speed of lightning in this virtual annihilation of space and time. Yet again, the communication between England and her distant possessions will be more than realized. Any thoughts about what that, other than talking about a new technology and the annihilation of time and space, but what else is that talking about, which in some ways is of interest to us? It's of interest not only here in some ways, but in fact, if we, I'm going in the wrong direction, if we go back to not so much that one, as perhaps that one. So here we have the train, and then here we have the telegraph. Yes, remind me? Sophia, thank you. Power, right. So one thing we like to say is, technology is building a more and more liberal world, but what are these people writing about? They're writing about empire. Not odd in some ways that the ghastly Brits should say, well, this is going to be a great technology to continue our imperial control around the world, but interestingly, even Americans should say, look, we are going to build an empire with this new technology. It will allow us to control. And not only that, but also all that talk about annihilating time and space. There are lots of questions that come up about what happened to the people in that space that you're now annihilating as you unite the East Coast and the West Coast by train or whatever. So we have to be a little cautious when we look at these things in that people read their current political interests and obsessions into the technology, whether it's true or not. Now, Harold Innis, in a very nice book on the telegraph, says, in the short term, actually, that's what did happen. Control was fairly dramatically centralized because of these technologies. The telegraph in some ways did allow the empire, and it allowed business, a much more long-term effect, to centralize power. What you had really before the telegraph was much more dispersed branch offices of businesses, which were almost autonomous, because if it took 6 weeks for a letter to get back and forth, you had to be able to make decisions on your own. But come the telegraph, you centralize power, and all decisions can be made in Washington or New York or in London for businesses spread around the world. So again, we have to see what people are saying and reading into. Other sort of, just to throw in unhappy predictions, but here we have the wonderful idea, not only of electricity is too cheap to meter, but everybody's actually going to have a nuclear power pack in their back garden to run their electricity, and that this will, a single uniformly spread community, sharing as neighbors the whole surface of the earth. So again, not only the prediction that we all want to have sort of highly radioactive machines in our back garden, but that by doing that alone, we will become a single community, is deeply instilled into how we think almost whatever the technology that we think about. And as we get to more and more cheap electricity, so we get Marshall McLuhan, who we've talked about before, who, sounding like all the people we've heard of so far, talking about communication being considered instantaneous in the late 18th century, he now says, ours is a brand new world of all at onceness, time has ceased and space has vanished, so there's the annihilation of space and time. We now live in a global village, a simultaneous happening. Now this was years before any of the technologies we have now, but for him television itself was enough to say, we are now a single community. So bear this in mind as we look at those kind of issues, that this is how people have been talking for a very long time. And there have been, in some sense, what I call wishing on technology. That is, we will project what we want for society, whether it be a perfect democracy, whether it be a global community, or whether it be an empire. And we will look at a technology and say, this is the device that's going to do it, just as Mark Stefik did with DRM. So, all right. So, and in that tells us in some way, what are the attractions of arguing this way? Well, one is that it makes us the wondrous outcome of all this evolutionary power. If we sit on top of the latest technology, well, boy, we're pretty good too. We're part of that society that has evolved and progressed forward. And so, in this wonderful thing, which we'll talk about later in the course by John Gast, American Progress. And when I say us, I just don't mean us as Western, I mean us as Californians, because in some way, for most of the 19th century, people said California, that's really where it's going to happen. Finally, the evolution of society will end up here. Using a great phrase, oddly enough, again, another early 18th century phrase, westward, the course of empire takes its way. And that's a phrase that should resonate for everybody in this room. I can see it does. Why? Westward, the course of empire takes its way. This idea that society is inevitably moving. Someone who's actually lived for a while over on this side of the it's coming this way, westward and further westward. Anyone know who made this quotation? Shame on you all. Bishop, as I would say, Berkeley, but pronounced over here as Berkeley. And why is this city called Berkeley? And why is it called after this weird 18th century Irish bishop? Because he said that. And why is the university called that? Because we kind of believe that we are where the course of empire ended up. So this was Berkeley, this is why the city was called that, why the university was called that, because he predicted that we're all going west. And here's Galt's great picture of that, and what you see here is sort of the future of liberty. And not only does she have the pioneers moving across the plains, we have the immigrants coming across, we have the wagon train, we have the gold diggers, we have the train, and she herself is carrying the telegraph wire, because that's really the final thing that is going to come out to the west coast and just conquer the world in many ways. So it's called American Progress, and it's all heading westward. So one reason we'd like to argue this way, and you can see all those 19th century Englishmen arguing this way, because you look at the latest technology and you say, that's us. Therefore, we're really great. And a nice argument has been made that in some ways there was a shift in the 19th century from a notion that had been around for a very long time, the Christian notion that we're superior because we have a superior religion, and therefore entitled to wipe out anybody who doesn't have our religion. Now we can move over and start to talk about technological superiority. And we are a better race because we have the right technology, and the other people are, we're advanced and they're, under, unless, whatever you want to say, developed. But it's a process. And also we make a nice, easy argument that if it got us here, then as we look around the world at problems that seem very difficult, the same route will get them into our position. So if we give one laptop per child to everybody in Africa, we'll solve all the problems that are faced by any nation over there, because it's just technology that does it. Another reason that people like it is, as we've been looking at this in some ways, is that Kevin Kelly says, look, it makes predictions easier. He doesn't actually say that it makes them more accurate. He just says it's easier. And of course it is. You just say, well, look at the technology and that'll tell me. And then it also, looking back, makes history easier in some way. We can find this simple point and say, well, that's what drove change, and we don't have to worry about anything else. The argument tonight comes up in France and England in the 17th century about Cleopatra's nose. Does anyone know? It's funny, it was mentioned in the newspapers today, so I thought I'd throw it in. Cleopatra's nose. Lawrence Stern uses it, but he's not the place. Montaigne, I think, uses it in France. Anyone know the argument of Cleopatra's nose? Well, the argument is that if Cleopatra's nose had been half an inch longer, the history of the world would have been different. Because Mark Antony wouldn't have fallen in love with her, so the rapprochement between Rome and Egypt wouldn't have happened, the war with Rome wouldn't have happened, so Rome wouldn't have developed as it did, Egypt wouldn't have developed, civilization would have been entirely different if just that nose had been half an inch longer. And it's a terribly attractive way to argue. Look, there's just one thing we can look at, and that will explain everything. So, we're looking again, when we look at technology, we have to ask ourselves, are we really looking at Cleopatra's nose? Another reason that it's tempting, again technologically, and we saw this a little bit in the iBook, is we can just say, look, one technology simply comes along and replaces another, and the world is wiped out. So again, to throw some French at you, this is very famous from the Hunchback of Notre Dame, as it's known in English, that the dean holds up a book in his hands, he's now set in the medieval period, and waves it at the church and says, ceci tuera cela, this will kill that. The book, this new technology, will simply wipe out everything that the church stands for. And that, people love that. In France in particular, people kept picking it up, so Gautier not long afterwards says that the newspaper will kill the book. So not only will the book kill the church, but the architecture, but the newspaper will kill the book. So one will wipe out the other. And then Émile Zola, who argues like this about trains, but also he looks at the great steel structure of Les Halles in Paris, wonderful, wonderful, which he writes about in the Vente de Paris, which is this great story of the market. And he says, look, this steel is going to wipe out, and the church that's right next to Les Halles, Saint-Eustache, is just going to disappear, because this new technology, this new world, it will simply replace the other. Now, if we look back over those grand predictions, the only reason we can get that photograph of Saint-Eustache now is because this has all been torn down. And while we think of the newspaper killing the book, well, Le Monde is actually in very dodgy circumstances at the moment and hardly able to finance itself, whereas Notre Dame, that was there at the very beginning of the argument, still stands, and stands pretty convincingly. So it's terribly tempting to make these arguments that this new stuff is just going to replace the old. What you often find is that the old endures a long way. Why worry? Very quickly, let me take you through some of these. Here was what was at the entrance of the Chicago World's Fair. Technological determinism at its best tells us that science explores, technology executes, and man conforms. Your role is simply to do what the technology tells you. And that, in fact, is the argument that Kevin Kelly is making in what technology wants. Our opinions, our views of the world, politics don't really matter anymore. Because technology is taking over, it knows where it's going, and our job is simply to follow along. It's an old argument, it's a nasty argument. This is one of the most unpleasant comments, I think, by H.G. Wells, again, one of those grand views of empire. He came to the States, and he loved the technology here. And he saw the ghastly moment when a train runs over someone on the tracks, and he just shrugs his shoulders and says, that's progress, that's the way we're going. And as he looks at every other race except for the white race, and he says, they're going that way too. And for the rest, those swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow, who do not come into the new needs or efficiency, because we're meant to conform to technology, well, the world is not a charitable institution, and I take it they will have to go. The whole tenor and meaning of the world as I see it is they have to go. And bound in that are so many creepy arguments, it's hard to believe. But people still make them. Kevin Kelly is still making that today about technology. The technium, what technology wants. We're going to go through a new explosion, and everybody who isn't on board will just be left behind, and too bad for them. And we have no responsibility to them because they couldn't keep up. Other ways we get it wrong, we back the wrong horse. We spend a lot of time saying, the world will be changed by nuclear technology, the control of the world, there will be a peace that will follow it. Probably the more significant technology of that era was the Kalashnikov. Still shaping the politics of the world, a nice, cheap, reliable technology that has caused mayhem around the world in different ways, bringing down very nasty people and bringing very nasty people into power. Another way is to assume in that the technology does all the work. Jeff and I both worked at the Xerox Research Center, which, not invented by us, but was famous in many ways for inventing what became the Apple computer. But we had to live through having a book written about it saying how Xerox fumbled the future, because it didn't know what to do with this technology. So the idea that the technology explains itself or opens a path ain't there. Okay, so very quickly, and this is just going to point now forward to the rest of the course, things that we miss then are the question of social embedding. And when we talk about the radio, the telephone, and the television in future classes, we will talk a great deal about that. We will talk in different ways about supersession. The idea we already have talked in part, the idea that the pencil will replace the typewriter. How many of you have a pencil? How many of you have a typewriter? Point made. All right. One has a typewriter. Good on you. All right. So maybe the typewriter's going to make a comeback, and I'm wrong. The car will simply replace the bicycle, as I said in that BBC survey. A lot of people think the bicycle is the most significant invention. The car didn't even get into it. When we look at manuscripts and paper, we'll see how it's very easy to tell these stories of progress by trivializing the past, by making people of the past look incredibly stupid and then saying, well, we're much more intelligent because of our technology. When we look at the university, we'll look in the ways that people have described changes in the university in very odd ways to justify their claims. We will look at the newspaper and say, there have been arguments since 1848, I think the first one I found is, that the new technology is going to replace the newspaper. The newspaper still hangs on, and we need to ask why. When we go to printing, we will discover the idea that printing comes along, is invented by Gutenberg, and changes the world. Did anybody watch the opening of the Beijing Olympics at Grand Festival? Did anyone remember this thing walking through? What was it? You remember? Do you remember what it was? Well, it's actually type. Printing type. And the Chinese were just gently reminding the rest of the world that they had had it for about 500 years before Gutenberg came along. In a very little tactful way, just so all those people who say, well, of course Gutenberg changed the world and that's why we're so advanced. The Chinese just wanted us to remember. There are errors of the sort that Jeff pointed out where we miss the social relations. So we have this wonderful picture of Dan Dare with a rocket and a flying car, but he still has a manservant trotting along beside him because somehow they missed that out. And we miss some things like the unintended consequences. Perhaps the most significant, Peter brought this up. We have one idea of what technology will do, and we put it in place to do that, and it does something completely different. The example I have in mind here, I was told by a friend in Sweden, they wanted to protect the reindeer herds, and they thought the best way was always to know where they were so they could protect them. So they put on all of the reindeer a little radio transmitter. It was a great idea to protect them, except that the hunters hacked the system. So then the hunters knew exactly where all the reindeer were and could very easily walk and kill them all. We have the idea of moral hazard, finally, and that is that as machines change to try to make us do something, we change our behavior. The classic example, I think, is probably what we say will make driving safer is to have airbags and seatbelts, and now people will be much safer. What does that do? It makes people feel so safe that they drive faster and faster and the roads become much more dangerous instead. As somebody once said, what we should do is take out all the airbags, all the seatbelts, and put a very large pointed spike sticking straight out of the center of the steering wheel. And that will make people, perhaps, adjust their behavior in the way that we hope. So again, what's called moral hazard, this idea that people won't behave as you predict, but will take advantage of changes that you've made. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit, again, not this time, but next time, about how to think about determinism. But what we want to ask in all these ways is what happened. What we talked about is what did come before and what didn't. Do we have our sequence right? What did or didn't follow? Is it really cause and effect? What did or didn't contribute? Did this thing really play a part in the changes that we're looking at? What happened elsewhere? And what's likely to be underestimated? But before we get to all that, we're going to look at the first technologies of information. We'll be talking to you on Thursday. These are the two readings, and we're going to talk about the appearance of writing, the thing that upset Plato so much. All right, thanks very much.